All right, so let's pray and get started. Father, we are so thankful to you for the privilege and the opportunity that we have to sit with one another around your word, open it up, and have you be our teacher. Instruct us in your Torah. Teach us not only commandments, but teach us who you are, how you are, what you are all about, and what you are like. And as we behold you transform us into the image of your Son, Yeshua, our Messiah, thank you that we get to have this privilege. So we trust you to be our teacher tonight. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are in the book of Numbers, and we are running a little bit behind. We should have been in the book of Deuteronomy today, but it's okay. It's okay. We're going to make up the time in a couple of weeks because we are going to have an introduction to the Nevi'im, that is the prophets, in a couple of weeks. But we have already talked a lot about that. You'll see the union between the two, the seam where the two come together. And so it would definitely not take us a whole session. And so we're going to combine that with our beginning in the book of Joshua. So today, then, we will have Numbers. Next week, we will have Deuteronomy. These are huge books. Deuteronomy is a little better known, but Numbers is not. Not only is it not well known, but it is even less understood, probably second to Leviticus, of course. But even with that, scholars would say about Numbers that the Numbers is kind of disjointed, and it doesn't really have a unity. It's kind of like a mishmash of different portions, chapter here talking about this, chapter talking about that. They don't really go together. Well, I know for once that's not true in principle. And I had studied the book of Numbers before, but not from this perspective, from the story perspective, right? From the plot perspective that I have now. And so I was able to, I was familiar with the content, and I knew that there was a unity to it. But even now, looking into the plot of it, it just blew my mind. In areas where it appears to bring together themes, in chapters that don't go together, they actually do. They actually go together. So we're going to start out with a little bit of an intro, then we'll go into the literary and the plot structures of the book, and I think you're going to love it. Okay, so the book of Numbers. Number one, it is a continuation from Leviticus and Exodus, and actually from Genesis all the way. And the primary reason we say that is because Numbers is, the book starts with what is called a preterite verb. And that means, preterite, of course, means past tense, simple past. But this is the kind of verb that is used for Hebrew narrative, so for telling stories. And it has a prefix, the word vav. You see it here. It's written as wow, but it is pronounced vav. So as you probably know, in the ancient time in Hebrew, the vav, the V sound was more of a W sound, more of a wa sound. So that the purists today will pronounce David's name, they will pronounce it Dawid. But in modern Hebrew, like I said, it changed from a wa to a v to a va. And so we pronounce David, not Dawid. And but that vav conjunction, it means and. It is the conjunction word and. And so it begins in Hebrew, vayedaber, and it translates, and he spoke. And he spoke to Moses, and God spoke to Moses in the wilderness. So because of it begins with and, so we know it's a continuation, it's a big chunk of text, but it's supposed to continue. So it's a continuation from Leviticus, which in turn is a continuation from Exodus, and Exodus is a continuation from Genesis. The reason is that Exodus begins with the same way, with the Vav conjunction, and so does Leviticus and now Numbers. So it is a story that is continuing. That's why we say that the Torah is one book. Of course, it's individual books in itself, but together they make a unity. They make a unit. And we see that best through the plot structure. And we'll get into that, of course. So what we have then is that this is a narratival continuation. That's a fancy term, right? To say that it is a continuing story, continuing narrative. And so in that sense, we don't have an independent start, we have a dependent start. It's continuation. But Numbers also shows that it has thematic continuation. So it has narratival continuation, but also has thematic continuation coming from Exodus and Leviticus, meaning the themes that are in Exodus and Leviticus do continue in Numbers. So the first 10 chapters of Numbers are about the camp of Israel. And that's the beginning of understanding this book. We have a lot of genealogy, a lot of counting, all of the tribes and the tribe of Levi and the families of the tribes of Levi. And, we get bored and we fall asleep and we wake up and it was like, okay, where was I? I'm not going back to that. But the theme that is tying it all together is that we're talking about the camp. With the tabernacle in the middle of it, in its midst. That's what we saw at the end of Exodus, of course. In Exodus, instructions for how to build it. This is how we built it. Chapter 40 of Exodus, the Lord's presence came into the tabernacle with the camp around it. And then Leviticus gives us instructions for how to come and worship and how not to pollute the tabernacle. And so Numbers here picks it up in the continuation. And he continues this theme of the camp with the tabernacle in the middle of it. Now, the tribes, the Numbers shows that the tribes, how the tribes are organized, right? I think it's chapter 3. It shows how the tribes are organized around the tabernacle. But because if you read carefully chapter 1, where we have the first census, the first counting, that's why it's called Numbers, right? Because there's numbers everywhere. If you notice there, actually, let me show you this. So you don't have to take my word for it, but I'm going to show you graphically because it's easy to see graphically. So we will be in Numbers 1. I'm going to make it big in a moment, so don't despair. Oh, I see. You're not looking at this. You can't see this yet. So let me set it up. Let me get out of here and come back and do it better so I can share not only the notes, but also the scripture, right? Okay, you can see it now. So here's Numbers chapter 1, and we get an introduction. And we get the names of the leaders from each tribe in the commandment to Moses to take Aaron and count the people with the leaders. Now, I want you to take a look at now, beginning in verse 20. In the Hebrew, take a look at the colors. I'm going to scroll down. Look, there's only green, 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 beginning in verse 20, all the way to, I think it's verse 40 something, 43. It's nothing but green, right? Okay, now let me go back up. Because it isn't only that it is nothing but green, which means the green means it is only one type of verb. And more specifically, it is what is called a participle. A participle. A participle in English is the ing word, right? So I am eating, I am running, I am, she is walking. That's a participle. That's the English participle. Or also in Hebrew, it tells you the one who does this. So the one who eats, the one who walks, the one who talks. That's also another way to translate the participle. So what we are getting here, not only is that a bunch of participle, nothing but participles. There's no other kind of verb. That has to mean something, right? But also notice this. Notice this word here. It's the word yotze. Yotze. It comes from yatsa. Ah, you know this one. This is the word for the Exodus, right? To go out. To go out as if in an Exodus. So that's the word yotze, but also the word pakad. That's the root word for this one is pakad. So yotze and pakad. Yotze and pakad. I want you to watch this. That's in verse 21. Look at verse 22. Pakad yotze. Verse 23. Pakad. 24. Yotze pakad. Yotze pakad. Yotze pakad. So not only do we have only participles, but we have only two verbs that are repeated. Yotze and pakad. Yotze and pakad. Both in participle. Yotze and pakad. Yotze and pakad. So what this is coming out to be is, you see it here in verse 30 and 31. So yotze, it says, whoever was able to go out to war. Whoever was able to go out to war. We get yotze, tzava, and from tzava we get sevaot. That's right. You know that word, right? The Lord of hosts, or the military host. That's really what that means, right? The angelic host, as they do war, that's as they do spiritual war. Here, Israel is presented as the hosts of the Lord. The camp is a military camp. That's my point. This is a military camp. And it's being counted as a word pakad, to be counted, to be numbered. You see it here in verse 31 in the English. Their numbermen of the tribe of Zebulun was blah, 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 blah. So all this, the majority of this chapter is all about, we're numbering people, we're numbering the tribes, we're numbering each tribe, and we're numbering the men who are able to go out to war, the men who are able to go out to war. And this is repeated, counting those who go to war, counting those who go to war, counting those who go to war. What this does is that it communicates to us the nature of the camp. This is a military camp. And overall, the military camp is so because the Lord is in it, and he is a mighty warrior, right? He is a man of war, man in quote, right? Um, so that's the nature of the camp. So coming back to our notes, then we have the first 10 chapters of Numbers with the tabernacle in the middle of it. It's about the camp of Israel with the tabernacle in the middle. The tribes are organized around it and its military force to protect it. So it's not only the camp, the people, but it's specifically with a special emphasis on this is a military camp. Why? Because we're on our way to Canaan and we're going to make war on Canaan to dispossess them from the land and take possession of the land. Why? Because God is mean and he hates people for no reason? No, because Canaan needs to be expelled from the land for several reasons, right? For their immoral practices, because they have polluted the land. Remember how the Lord told Abraham, in the fourth generation, your people, your descendants will come back here, because when the sin of the Canaanites and the Amorites and all the ites has reached its limit. Well, I mean, we can relate a little bit to that. We live in a nation in which justice is being perverted. Good is evil and evil is good. Children are being corrupted by our own leaders. And all manner of sexual deviation have become mainstream. So I don't think we're at the level of Sodom and Gomorrah just yet. You remember Abraham interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah? Said, Lord, if there are 50 righteous, would you not destroy it? Sure. If there are 10, if there are 5, I don't think he got to 5, but there weren't even 10. There was one family that was kind of a little righteous, and that was Lot and his wife, which was kind of suspect. And then the 2 daughters. And remember, the Lot tried to get their, I don't know, their intended to come along with them, and they laughed at him. So they didn't come. So it was just the 4 of them, and wasn't even 5. And there wasn't even a whole lot of righteousness there. Remember what the wife did and what the daughters did. I mean, it was a mess. I think we have a whole lot more righteous people in the United States. I had some interesting experiences yesterday. So I met with someone who was just trashing and bashing Dallas Seminary. They don't love Israel and they say this and that and the other. Okay, sure. But it so happened that I came that earlier that day from a chapel at the seminary in which the president of the seminary had a panel interviewing 5 Messianic Jews with whom he is friends, personal close friends. They've done ministry for years. One of them is a professor. One of them is the chairman of the board of the seminary. I mean, is this really a seminary that bashes Israel and trashes Israel? I don't think so. And they were talking about the hostages and Hamas and all of that, in a way that we would be very proud to hear, and I was. So there are many righteous in our country, particularly those who love the nation of Israel, those who bless Israel, those who suffer, like Peter says, that righteous Lot suffered because of the perversion that was in Sodom and Gomorrah. Many of us here suffer because of all this. So when I hear people, talking about destroy America and all that, I'm like, I'm not sure you understand your Bible. So anyway, the Lord is a mighty warrior, and the camp is a war camp, but also the presence of the Lord in the tabernacle makes the camp with the Levites around the camp to protect and to minister in the tabernacle, to defend, to protect the tabernacle against pollution. It makes the tabernacle a holy, I'm sorry, it makes the camp a holy camp. So the theme of the first 10 chapters of Numbers is the camp. How the camp is a war camp and it is a holy camp. Those two themes are going to come back later as the book advances from chapter 10 and we get now into the camp moving. The camp begins to move in chapter 10. The cloud lifts up and begins to move. They're on their way to the edge of the land to confront the Canaanites. And those two themes are going to uh, guide us into understanding what the book is all about. That the camp is a war camp and that it is a holy camp. We could probably understand a little bit that it is a holy camp after all. In Numbers, we do get a lot of flavor from Leviticus, right? So, yeah, it's kind of like, okay, I can see that. But also that it is a war camp. That's kind of new. That's kind of new. Um, and you're going to see how it is so important in this book for what's going to happen. All right, so we'll keep moving along. So the theme of Exodus, which is, I will be your God, which means I will dwell with you in the tabernacle. Remember from our class on Exodus. This theme was developed in Leviticus because, it's all about the Lord dwelling with Israel and how to prevent pollution so that his tabernacle is not polluted with uncleanness, and he may remain to dwell and continue to dwell, remain dwelling in the tabernacle. So it's developed in Leviticus, and now it continues in the book of Numbers. And he continues with the instructions for the priests and the Levites to keep the tabernacle holy from all uncleanness. So the Lord's presence may continue, and Israel can worship him, can worship before him, fulfilling the consequence of Exodus. You remember when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he came down with his face that was shining, indicating this is God's desire for Israel to be in his presence and be transformed into the image. Yeah, that's what the image means. The likeness means our humanity. The image means that we have so much holiness that we shine. So Adam and Eve, they were shining. Their body shone. It was shiny like Moses's face. And they lost the image. They didn't lose the likeness. They were created in the image and the likeness of God. They didn't lose the likeness. We didn't lose our humanity, but we certainly lost the glory shining, the glory of God shining through us, right? Like reflecting, like the moon reflects the light of the sun. We reflected, Adam and Eve reflected God's glory. But that's God's goal, right? That we be transformed into the image of his son. That's what that means. Remember when he was transfigured in the mountain, and Peter and the gang, they were like, oh my gosh, we need to make a sukkah here for you, and for you. And, this is amazing. And they could see it was an anticipation, it was a foretaste of Yeshua in his glory, in the glory of his kingdom. Not only was his clothing shining, but he himself was shining, right? And so that's the image, and that's what God was indicating through Exodus. That's the message of Exodus. And so it is reinforced through Leviticus and now in Numbers. So Numbers also has geographic ties with Exodus and Leviticus. So we say that because in Numbers, Numbers begins in the wilderness. They're still in Sinai. And in fact, that's the name of the book in Hebrew, Bemidbar, which means in the wilderness. But they're still in the wilderness of Sinai. But it is in Numbers that the cloud is going to begin to move. And so it accounts for the move of the camp from Sinai to the edge of the promised land. So we see that that's a geographic tie between Numbers and Leviticus and Exodus, because in Leviticus and Exodus, Israel is at Sinai, right? And so here in Numbers, they begin in Sinai, but they're going to move to the edge of the land. So that's a geographic tie between the two, a continuation. But I love this part here. There is chronological connections between Numbers and Exodus and Leviticus. And so we're going to get to see here a few passages that I have for you here on the screen. This is fascinating. I love this. This is really, really good. So we're going to piece together the chronology between Numbers and Leviticus and Exodus. So look at this. Numbers 1:1. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, on the first of the second month, in the second year, after they had come out of the land of Egypt." So second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. When did they come out? Duh. On Passover, right? What day is that? What month? Well, it is the 14th of the month of Nisan. And the Lord told Moses, this will be the first month for you. So that now Israel is going to have two first months. So the first month is going to be on Nisan, but there was also a new year on the seventh month. Yeah, that's kind of like, whoa, what do you mean? Well, you know what? There were other nations around in the ancient Near East that did the same thing. They would celebrate a New Year festival at the end, or in the seventh month, exactly on the same day. But then they will also celebrate in the spring. So it was a spring and fall kind of a thing, because these two times are related to agriculture. So in the fall, you begin planting, you end the harvest, and you begin planting, then you go, and then in the spring, you begin, you begin planting in the fall and you begin harvesting in the spring. So that's why we have the harvest of barley beginning on Passover, right? So the first fruit of Passover is the barley, and then you make unleavened bread with the barley. And that begins the harvesting season. You're going to move on to Shavuot with the harvest of wheat, and then you'll go into the summer with the summer fruits, primarily the olives and the grapes, and then you finish the harvesting. You celebrate it on Sukkot, and you begin plowing, preparing the ground, and then planting, and you go into the rainy season, the early rain and the latter rain and all that stuff, good stuff. So here, Numbers 1:1 is telling us that this is in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. So they had already spent a year, almost a year in Sinai, because it took them about 3 months to come from Egypt, go through the wilderness at a very slow pace, and they finally come to Sinai, and then they stay there until the year is completed. So they must have stayed there the remainder 9 months or so, until this day here. So here we're told that we're in year 2, and look, it says on the first of the second month. So day 1 of month 2, not month 1, but month 2 of year 2, right? So this is not Nisan. This is at the end of Nisan, then you get to the next month. I can't remember what it's called, but it is month 2. That's where numbers begin. That's where the narrative here begins, right? The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. And here he is going to give him instructions to count the people, count the Levites, count the camp, organize the camp, and do all of that stuff. Later on, we're going to see what happens later in month 2. So they have about 2-3 weeks to do what God is telling them to do. And then what's going to happen is that the camp is going to begin moving. I believe it's day 20 of month 2. So there will be these 3 weeks for them to count the people and organize the camp and do all of that. And then the camp is going to start moving. Before we get there, though, we then go back to Exodus to pick up the chronology. So in Exodus 40, verse 2, it says, on the first day of the first month, first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. What is the first month? It's the month of Nisan, right? Where we have Passover. Passover is on the 14th. On the 10th, remember, the sheep, the little lamb was chosen that was going to be sacrificed 4 days later for Passover. So that was on day 10. So here we saw this, right, in Exodus, that on the first day of the month, then that's when the glory of God came to the tabernacle. The tabernacle was set up, anointed, the glory of God came and inaugurated the tabernacle. We have it again in verse 17. Now, in the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle was erected. It was completed, erected, anointed, the glory of God came. Then we have Leviticus 9:1. It says, now it came about on the 8th day that Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. This is Leviticus 8, 9, and 10, when the priests, that will be Aaron and his sons, were anointed and they were ordained. This is the ordination ritual that took place for 7 days and then is concluded on the 8th day. So this is the 8th day. So this is 1 week and 1 day after the glory of God came to inaugurate the tabernacle. This is month 1, day 8 of second year, right? So only a week has passed. Then we get Numbers 7:1. It says, now on the day that Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle, you hear that? On the day that Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle, what day is that? Day 1, month 1, right? Year 2. He anointed it and consecrated it with all its furnishings and the altar of all its utensils. So Number 7:1 is a parallel to Exodus 40. They're both talking about the day when the tabernacle was finished and it was anointed and consecrated. What day is that? Day 1, month 1. So I want you to notice this. Numbers begins the first day of the second month. And then number 7, it takes us back. It's a flashback. In number 7, it takes us back a month before. So number 1 is day 1 of month 2. Number 7 is day 1 of month 1. So he's going to tell us what happened before, right? So he's going to go back and catch us up, beginning in chapter 7. It's a flashback. We have that in all the movies, right? Half of the movies, 3 months earlier. And, they show you what happened, how the guy and the girl met, so. So now on the day that Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle, he anointed it and consecrated it with all its furnishings and the altar and all its utensils. He anointed them and consecrated them also. Then the leaders of Israel, the heads of their fathers' households, made an offering. They were the leaders of the tribes, and they were the ones who were over the numbered men. So these are the men we see in chapter 1. And we're going to see in chapter 7 is a long chapter where it's very repetitive. That's the one where you and I fall asleep. Well, not you, me primarily, right? So you would never fall asleep reading scripture. So this is where it repeats and repeats and repeats, and so brought, and it gives you a list of the stuff they brought, and it is identical. I'm pretty sure Moses was like, guys, can we invent something like cut and paste, So, um, so that's that chapter. So it tells us that this gift that the heads of the tribes brought, it began on day 1 of month 1 when the tabernacle was inaugurated. They brought these gifts to the tabernacle, and then a month later they began counting the people on the day 1 of month 2. Then we go to Numbers 9 verse 1. In 1:1 we were month 2. We backed up in chapter 7, and now in chapter 9 we're going to come right back up. So Numbers 9:1 says, "Thus the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, now let the sons of Israel observe the Passover at its appointed time." When is the appointed time? On the 14th day. When is he saying this? The first day of the month. The first day of Nisan, he's telling them, hey guys, you have 2 weeks. Remember the Passover? A year ago, we came out of Egypt. Okay, it's that time again. You need to celebrate it in a couple of weeks on day 14. So on the 14th day of this month, at twilight, you shall observe it. At its appointed time, you shall observe it according to all its statutes and according to all its ordinances. So Moses told the sons of Israel to observe the Passover. They observed the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So the sons of Israel did. Chapter 15, verse 15 now, it says, now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, that is day 1 of month 1. We're going back again, right? We were on day 14, Nisan, until they finished it. They did it. So now we go back to day 1, month 1. Now, on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. And in the evening, it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. Now, chapter 10, we're going forward now. Chapter 10, verse 11. Now, in the second year, in the second month, we finally got out of the first month. We've been going back and forth. Now we're going back to the second month. Remember, that's how the book started, right? In the second month. But look, the book started on day 1 of the second month. Now here, look where we're at. In the second month, on the 20th of the month, on the 20th of the month, the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. This was a 3-day walk. So they went for 3 days in the and the cloud stopped and the camp got to rest. So they moved out for the first time according to the commandment of the Lord through Moses. And we're going to come back to chapter 10 in a little bit. But let's take a look at chapter 40, because chapter 40 talks about this same thing. When the cloud began to move, we know it began on day 20, second month of year 2, right? So Exodus 40 gives us an overview of the whole thing. It says, Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord had filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day when it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle day by day, and there was fire in it by night in the sight of all the house of Israel. So this passage here, it kind of gives us an overview of the 40 years that the tabernacle, the camp was in the wilderness, and the glory of God was over the tabernacle, the day by day and by night. We see the beginning of that in Numbers chapter 10, right? On the 20th day of the second month, that's when the cloud moved for the first time. And all the camp is moving. The camp with all the Levites, making sure everybody's carrying what corresponds to them according to the instructions from earlier in the book. And the camp is moving in military fashion, with all the men able to go out to war, being counted, as we saw in chapter 1. All right, we're not done yet. We got a couple more. So Numbers 13:17, it says, when Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, now we're talking about the spies now. The story of the spies is in chapters 13 and 14. So we're in chapter 13 now. So Moses sent the spy out to spy out the land of Canaan, and he said to them, go up into the Negev, then go up into the hill country, see what the land is like. How is the land? Is it fat or lean? Meaning, is it fruitful, or is there a wilderness? Are there trees in it or not? Meaning olive trees and vineyards. That's the kind of trees that we're looking for primarily. Make an effort then to get some of the fruit of the land. And we're going to see the time now. It says, now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. So what fruit are they going to find? They're going to find grapes. And that's exactly what they found. They brought a cluster of grapes that it was so big that it had to be carried on a pole by two guys on their shoulders, one behind the other, a pole on their shoulders, and the huge cluster of grapes hanging from the pole. If you look at a good commentary or a Bible dictionary, it's going to tell you that this time of the ripe grapes was at the end of July. That's where you begin to harvest the grapes, and then you would finish. You will be done on time for hopefully before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, and you will certainly celebrate this huge harvest that you just had, this blessing from God. You will celebrate it on Sukkot, right? So watch this now. Here's the last chronology verse, Numbers 13:25. Now it says, when they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days. So they came back at the end of 40 days. So they went up at the end of July, around the end of July, and they came back 6 weeks later. So a month and a half later, that's 40 days, a month and a half later. So if you're there around the end of July, a month later will put you into September, into the middle of September. That is the time of the feast. So they come back. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's on Jewish tradition says that they came back on Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur is when they are going to give out a bad report on the land. Not a good season to come before the Lord with such unbelief and such fear. And we're going to see the implications of that in a moment. So So that is the chronological connections between Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Pretty amazing. I don't know about you. Maybe I'm a little nerdy here, but I love these numbers and see the chronology, how, you know, this thing was in a couple of months. In a couple of months, you finish the tabernacle, the glory of God come, the priests are ordained, and you celebrate Passover. And then the Lord tells you, count everybody on month 2. And then 20 days later, you're on the move. That's amazing. Everything that happened. And you are now on your way to the promised land. Okay. So we have all of these connections, but the most important one at the macro level is that there is plot continuation between Genesis all the way to the book of Numbers. So you will recall the plot talks about the context, conflict, climax, consequence, and conclusion, right? So the beginning of the story, the problem in the story, the confrontation in the story, and then the theological message of the story, and then the final conclusion. So in Genesis 10, the conflict of the Torah develops, meaning Canaan, the seed of the serpent, who has been cursed, has possession of the land. Therefore, it's called the land of Canaan. The land which the seed of the woman who has been blessed is supposed to inherit, not Canaan. It was for the seed of the woman because they are the ones that are blessed. They are supposed to have possession of the land. So you see how this is a conflict here? How can the seed of the serpent, the people who are cursed, how can they have possession of the land? This can't be. It doesn't happen anywhere else in Genesis. Lot ends up outside of the land. Ishmael ends up outside of the land. Esau ends up outside of the land. The one who is the seed of the serpent cannot inherit the land except for Canaan, beginning in chapter 10 of Genesis. We thought there was nothing good coming out of Genesis 10. This is huge. It is the main conflict of the whole Torah. Because what God is going to do, this is an irony that needs to be corrected. He is going to set out to correct this thing. That Canaan is to be exiled from the land. And the seed who is blessed, the seed of Abraham, needs to come in and take possession of the land. So the question is, how is this going to be corrected? Well, God could have done it himself. He could have sent angels. He could have, sent a flood, sent, what is it that he sent over Sodom and Gomorrah, all of the fire and brimstone and all this stuff, and kick the Canaanites out of the land. But he didn't choose to do it that way. He chose Israel to do this work for him. Therefore, Israel is a war camp. Israel is a war camp so they can make war on God's physical enemies, right? God has the human army and the angelic army. So their job was to dispossess the Canaanites and possess the land because they were the blessed people. But a great crisis is going to arise in the book of Numbers. Israel is going to refuse to do this work that God has given them. This is the confrontational climax that was supposed to happen in the book of Numbers between the seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, but it did not happen, not in Numbers. It's going to happen in Joshua, finally, between these two seeds. And it should have brought about, so what this is going to do is that it's going to bring about an elaborate plot consequence. So because this is a climax, a failed climax, a failed confrontation, the story, the theological message of the story is going to be huge here. And let me tell you, when I was studying this, I was shocked. I've never seen the consequence section be so long. It's usually a story. Remember in Exodus, the consequence is just one story. It's just Moses coming down from the mountain with his face shining. That's it. And in many stories, it's a very short portion of the story. But here, because this climax that didn't happen, it's so huge, it's so important, it has so many implications. The not only is the consequence here in Numbers going to be long, but it's going to be very elaborate, very elaborate. In a way, it is simple, it is just complex. It's not difficult, it is simple, but it is complex. It is multifaceted. This is the contribution of the book of Numbers to the plot of the Torah, meaning what we will call a twist in the plot, right? What should have happened didn't happen. When you're watching a movie and you see, do they have the right guy? Is this? And then you see how long until the movie ends. No, they're still halfway. This can't be. It's not the solution because there's still another hour to the movie. So they're going to throw a twist at you. And that's what happens here. The Torah should have began here and wrapped up here in Numbers, and then go into Joshua, and we would have had only 4 books of the Torah. There wouldn't have been any need for Deuteronomy. So because of this, we're going to see what is the role of Deuteronomy? Why was it added? Why was it needed? And we see the root of that here, because Israel refused to confront the Canaanites as they should have here. And so now we're going to have the 40 years and ramping up again to enter the land again. So that's where Deuteronomy is going to come in. All right, so that is the plot continuation between Numbers and coming from Genesis all the way to the book of Numbers. And that is the contribution that Numbers makes to the plot, the macro plot of the Torah. Okay. Now let's take a look at the literary structure of Numbers. And what we're going to do actually is we're going to jump back and forth. So we're not going to get necessarily into the details of this literary structure. I'm going to just show you a couple things here. But I'm going to let you get into the details of this when you study on your own. And then we're going to jump to the plot structure. And that's where we put everything together. So here, we just want to look at the main points here. So number one, this is the structure of the whole book, right? So the first 10 chapters, as we said, they're all about the Lord is in Israel's camp, making it a holy war camp. So it's not, I should change this a little bit. It's not a holy war camp. It is a camp. It's a war camp and a holy camp. You see how I'm separating the two. It's not one thing. It's not holy war, but it is a war camp and a holy camp. We'll see that a little more in detail. And we see how the first section of these chapters, the first 4 chapters, is going to talk about the defenders of the camp, the military, and then the ministers of the tabernacle. And then we see the holiness of the camp. And you can go into the reading the sections. I recommend that you read, whenever you read Numbers as a whole, that you read it with this literary structure right next to it as a guide, so you understand what each chapter is all about, and it will help you navigate to understand the book. Then the second section of the book is the Exodus generation does evil and suffers death outside the land. Again, when you read it with this in mind, it helps you understand what's going on here. Then we have the camp under the new generation. So you realize that we have the Exodus generation and the second generation or new generation, right? Because the Lord says this first generation is not going to enter the land. They're going to die in the wilderness. It will take 40 years. But the new generation, there are children who were not of war age, meaning they were under 20 years old at the beginning of Numbers. They will be the generation that is going to go in and possess the land. So here we make the switch in chapter 20. It makes the switch where the camp now is under the next generation, the new generation. But they experience victory and evil, and they experience holiness and defilement. Here's where the holy camp is defiled. So the war camp refuses to make war on the Canaanites. The holy camp is going to be defiled. And that's how Numbers takes us to the majority of this book. So these themes that come from chapter 1 are going to be developed because the first generation is supposed to go to war, but they don't. And the second generation receives this holy camp, and they're going to defile it. You will remember the story when they mess up with the daughters of Moab, and they sit into having sacrifices and eating of the sacrifice meat that was offered to the gods of Moab, and so they defile themselves, and many died. And that's where Pinchas, or Phineas in English, right? That's when he goes in and he kills the people who were, shockingly, they were just having intercourse right at the entrance of the tabernacle. Boy. So, and then the book is going to end with this, what I call a land grant and inheritance code. We're going to come back to this because this is important, and we'll explain a little more. So those four main points become our outline to understand the book. And so here I have a message statement of the book. So Moses wrote the book of Numbers to show the second generation. He's going to write it after the 40 years, of course. How can you tell about the 40 years before they happen, right? So he wrote this book after the 40 years because he's going to combine things from the first generation and the second generation. So Moses wrote the book of Numbers to show the second generation of Israelites after the Exodus that the first generation died in the wilderness without possessing the land, in spite of God dwelling with them in their camp because of unbelief. So he's going to show them that they died because of unbelief. That leads to disobedience, of course. They refuse to make war on the Canaanites. But his purpose is to convince them, in order to convince them that they should overcome their own unbelief and prepare for future life in the land, meaning they should obey and enter the land and possess it. So we're going to get these glimpses of the failure of the second generation, but also a foretaste of whenever they enter the land. And with this, we really make sense of the book, of those sections that some scholars feel that it doesn't go together. It's, disjointed. They use that phrase. It's like, no, you just need to sit down and study a little more. So let's take a look now at the plot structure of Numbers. So review, right? Numbers is primarily a historical narrative. It's telling us a story, even though it's having a lot of counting, a lot of names, a lot of numbers and all that stuff. But as a whole, it is a story. It is a narrative So as such, it has plot. And plot is the universal structure of stories. We've done this now for all the other books, right? The structure of the plot is context, conflict, climax with resolution, and then consequence, which is where the main theological message of the story is, and then conclusion. So we're going to apply that to the book of Numbers, and we're going to see some surprising things here. So the context is that the Lord is in Israel's camp, and he was in Israel's camp, and he made it a camp of war and holiness. I fixed the statement here, right? It's not a holy war camp, but it's a camp of war, a war camp and a holy camp. That's the context. And that goes for 10 chapters. Then we begin to have the first conflict, the first sign of conflict. If you look at those first 10 chapters, there's nothing that goes wrong there. Nothing. There's no conflict there. We begin to see the conflict in chapter 11. When the cloud moves, it goes for 3 days. They arrive at Paran after 3 days, and people complain of evil. That's the first sign. Uh-oh, we have a problem. We've seen this again before. We've seen Israel complaining. And here it uses the word evil, as in good and evil. Good, what makes you fruitful. Evil, what does not make you fruitful. But they're accusing God of evil for not feeding them. And the Lord is going to feed them. He's going to give them food, meat, up, that will come out of their noses. That's what we call the incitement. This is the inciting incident. The beginning of conflict, the first sign of conflict. Then we get complication. I guess it's just complication, not just complication one, but because there's only one complication in this case. And the complication is that the war spies gave an evil report. You see the word evil again? It's used in the Hebrew here. The spies gave an evil report of the land. I should have said of the land here. And they refuse to make war on the Canaanites. We saw that, right? They give an evil report and they refuse to make war. So the war camp fails to make war. God constituted it into a war camp so they could go out and make war and obey his charge for Israel to dispossess the Canaanites, to right this wrong, to correct this possession of the land by the people of Canaan who have no business possessing the land. Israel refuses. The first generation refuses to do so. That's the complication, but that's not the worst part. Here's what's going to happen then. That the camp leaders, they're going to decide to stone the faithful spies, meaning Caleb and Joshua. They're going to decide to stone them and return to Egypt. They're going to say, we're going to elect a leader and we're going to return to Egypt. That's the crisis. That's the point in which something's got to happen here. A confrontation has to ensue here, which is the climax, right? So in the climax, we have the confrontation, which is that the Lord announces he's going to destroy the people. Whenever you have a confrontation is between two parties, right? The first one takes an action, and the second one responds to that action. So you have first action, second action. Here, the first action is from the Lord. The Lord announces to Moses, get away from me, I'm going to destroy them. And again, Moses intercedes for Israel. And then we get the resolution. The resolution in chapter 40, verse 20. Let's read it. It's a beautiful passage here. So the Lord said, I have pardoned them. I'm sorry. Where did that come from? Okay. I have pardoned them according to your word. Because here's what Moses says, right? Uh, but Moses said to the Lord, verse 13, then the Egyptians will hear of it. Well, the Lord is going to say, the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? And how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? I will smite them with pestilence and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they. And by doing that, he wouldn't violate the Abrahamic covenant, because guess what? Moses is a descendant of Abraham. So he will still be within his right and would not revoke the covenant. He would just start a new generation with Moses. But Moses said to the Lord, here's the response, right? We have the confrontation here. First action, the Lord says, go to destroy them. Here's their answer to that action. Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for by your strength you brought up this people from their midst, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. And they have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of this people. You dwell with them, your tabernacle is with them. For you, O Lord, are seeing eye to eye, while your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. This is quoting from the early chapters of Numbers, right? Now, if you slay this people as one man altogether, then the nations who have heard of your fame will say, because the Lord could not bring these people into the land which he promised them by oath, therefore he slaughtered them in the wilderness. But now I pray that the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you also have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. Wow, what a speech, huh? And God says, I will do it. I will do what you just said. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. What does that mean? Filled with the glory of the Lord means filled with their corpses. So Moses, I am not going to kill all of them, but I'm going to kill this generation. They're going to die and they will not enter the land. So he says, surely all the men who were counted, all the men of war who were counted in chapter 1, right? Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, Shema, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurn me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants, keep that in mind, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites live in the valleys, so turn tomorrow and set out to the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. I want you to go back to the wilderness. He didn't tell them yet it's going to be 40 years, but he will in a moment. So let's go back here to the notes. So we have the confrontation between the Lord and Moses. We have the resolution. I will forgive them. By the way, this is like the third time the Lord says to Moses, get out of my way. I'm going to destroy these people. Why do you think that is? Let's pause here for a moment. Think about that. Is it that God is kind of like super emotional? He kind of loses it in the moment. He's like, I'm gonna destroy you. And then he's like, okay, I'm calmed down a little, okay, I'm not gonna do it. Why is God doing this? Doesn't he know Moses is gonna pray to him and he's going to decide, okay, I'm going to relent. Number one, he's not changing his mind. Get that phrase out of your brain. He's not changing his mind because it says God is not a man that he should change his mind. What it is here, in many translations have it, and God changed his mind, but it's a wrong translation. What it means is relent. He relented. I think we talked about that last time. God relented. Kind of like Jonah, right? Jonah goes and he tells the people, 40 days, God's going to destroy all of y'all. He was from the south. God's going to destroy all of y'all. And then it didn't happen. Whoa, what's up with this? Is Jonah a false prophet? Because he prophesied, is God's going to destroy it, but it didn't happen. So is he a false prophet? No, actually. He says, I knew it. This is why I didn't want to come. Because I know that you are a God who relents. You are a God that has compassion. When people repent, you relent and you forgive. And I knew this was going to happen. I didn't want the Ninevites to be forgiven and relented. I wanted you to destroy them. So that's what's happening here. Now, here's the thing. Not only is this something that happened in time, but this is also a message for Israel in the scriptures themselves. So there's a difference between the text and the event. We've talked about that way earlier. We have the event, and that's great. But more importantly is the text. The text is speaking not only to that generation, but it's speaking to all Israel at all times. And what this is saying is, watch out, Israel. There may come a point in which God will bring about destruction. And didn't it happen? He exiled Israel out of the land for 70 years. And then he did it again now for 2,000 years. That's what this text and these occasions in which God says, I'm going to destroy these people. Okay, but I'm going to relent now. But there will come a time in which he will say, I will not relent. You are going to go into exile. And nothing is going to change that. And so, in a way, this text is a warning to Israel. You can't mess with God because you're going to get burnt. So that's the climax and the resolution, right, at that moment. But now we have the consequence. And I told you the consequence here is huge. Look at all this. All of this is the consequence. However, I want you to notice there's a pattern going on here. We first have an announcement, then a short-term report and a long-term report. Why do I say this? Okay. We first have an announcement because it is what God says, this is what I will do. This is what's going to happen, future. And he gives it to us in three, what do I call this? Three categories, so to speak. And then the three categories are repeated as the announcement again. And then we have a short-term report, meaning it is a report because it already happened. It's beginning to happen. What he announced, the judgment he announced here twice, now is going to happen in the short term, immediately, and in the long term. Remember, this book is written after the 40 years. So he's going to be able to tell us the Lord did it at that time, but also in these 40 years, it also happened what the Lord said was going to happen. This is the fallout. This is the consequence of the confrontation, the conflicts first, that Israel refused to make war on the Canaanites. God came and confronted them and he forgave them, but he said, they will die in the wilderness, right? So here's the announcement. Number one, the men of war of the first generation will die without entering the land. That's what we just read, verses 21 and 23. Let's read it again quickly. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord, meaning the corpses of the people that are going to die in the wilderness. Surely, all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I perform in Egypt, ye have spurned me, verse 23, shall by no means see the land. So the men of war of the first generation, they will die without entering the land, right? That's number one. Look at number one here. It's repeated. The men of war of the first generation will die without entering the land. The same thing. Only here is in verses 26 to 30. So let's take a look at this real quick. Verse 26. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation who are grumbling against me? I have heard the complaints of the sons of Israel, which they are making against me. They say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness, even all your numbered men, chapter 1, according to your complete number from 20 years and old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Surely you shall not come into the land in which I swore to settle you, except, here we get the except. The except is going to be number 2. You see, the faithful spies and their descendants will enter and possess the land. Let's go back to verse 24. But my servant Caleb, he's not going to mention Joshua here, but he means both, right? But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants will take possession of it. So that's why I say here, the faithful spies and their descendants will enter and possess the land. But look, it's going to be repeated in verses 30b and 31. So we go to 30. That's why we stopped here. Except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. The faithful spies, they will enter. It says, your children, however, whom you've said would become a prey, I will bring them in, the children, their generation, the next second generation, I will bring them in, and they will know the land which you have rejected. So that's number 2 here. It's repeated. The faithful spies and their descendants will enter and possess the land. And then look at number 3. The second generation, not the first, but the second generation, will live in the wilderness until the first generation dies. That's the 40 years. We'll look at verse 25 for this. It says, now the Amalekites and the Canaanites live in the valleys. Turn tomorrow and set out to the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. Turn to the wilderness. He didn't tell them for how long, but it says, go back to the wilderness. That's in the first announcement. In the second announcement, in verse 32 and 35, now he's going to elaborate on this. He says, but as for you, your corpses, you first generation, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the wilderness. So you see, that's why I put here the second generation will live in the wilderness 40 years until the first generation dies. So it's the same thing we have in the announcement. It's given twice, back to back, point by point. Then we're going to get a report that this exact thing happened. So we're going to get that it happened in the short term and it happened in the long term. So first we see that the spies who brought an evil report died immediately. Verse 36. As for the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, and who returned and made all the congregation grumble against him and bringing out a bad report concerning the land, even those men who brought out the very bad report of the land died by a plague before the Lord. They died before the Lord. They died immediately. The faithful spies, right? You remember this goes with this. Number one goes with number one. The men of war of the first generation will die. Here's the spies of the first generation who brought an evil report. They died immediately. That's a short-term report. Then it says the faithful spies were alive in the second generation, verse 38. Look at verse 38. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, remained alive out of those men who went to spy out the land. They were the faithful spies. They remain alive, and they're alive here today as I'm writing this book 40 years later, right? So the faithful spies were alive in the second generation. And then report number 3, we're going to have the report number 3, the second generation will live in the wilderness. It says that many that will live in the wilderness until the first generation dies. And so we're told here, many of the first generation died also immediately at that time. Not immediately, but at that time. So we go to verse 39, it says, when Moses spoke these words, all the sons of Israel, the people, mourned greatly. In the morning, however, they rose up early and went up to the ridge of the hill country, saying, here we are. We have indeed sinned, but we will go up now. We're going to obey the Lord now. These guys, they don't get it. Look at this. He says to them, verse 42, do not go up, or you will be struck down before your enemies. For the Lord is not in your camp, is not among you, your group of people, as you're going to go out, and he's not going to be with you. But they still went up. They still went up. And look at this verse 44. But they went up heedlessly, meaning they didn't shema, right? They didn't hear the Lord. They went up to the ridge of the hill country. Neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses left the camp. Literally, the Lord was not in their midst as they went up to make war. And they lost. And many of them died. So that's why we say many of the first generation died in the short term. You see that, right? Now we get the long-term report. Number one, this is going to be a slightly different organization, but it's the same themes. So number one, it says success. Here we have look at the chapters. This goes from chapter 15 to chapter 20. Long-term report. What we have here in this passage is we have success of the second generation and rebellion and death of the first generation. I want you to notice here that in these chapters, we have chapters 16, 17, and 18. What do we have in those chapters? The rebellion of Korah. You see why rebellion and death of the first generation is there? But we also have success of the first generation, because in chapter 15 comes after 14, right? But 14 was this massive happening. And then in 15, it's like, we start all over again. Nothing happened. Like when you enter the land and you possess the land, and let me read it to you because it's shocking how the contrast is so sharp. It says, now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land where you are to live, which I am giving you, then make an offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering or a sacrifice to fulfill a special vow, or as a free will offering, or in your appointed times to make a soothing aroma to the Lord from the herd or from the flock. The one who presents his offering shall present. It's like, Moses, we just had this huge happening here in chapter 13 and 14. It's like chapter 15, it's like nothing happened. You see why some scholars say this thing is like put together here. It's like, this thing doesn't even make sense. all disjointed stuff here. No, what this is a foretaste of the second generation, right? It says, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land, not the first generation, the second generation. This is a foretaste of the first generation. So that's why in the long-term report, I say that it gives us the success of the second generation in the form of a foretaste, right? But it also shows rebellion and death of the first generation. Now look what happens here. Report number 2. Now we're going to go from chapters 20 and 21. Things are going to begin to change here. We have some success, but also rebellion of the second generation. It's like the second generation is learning the bad things from the first one. But remember, that's why Moses is writing this book, to tell the second generation, y'all need to avoid what the first generation did. So, and here's the report. These guys are learning some of the bad ways of the first generation. So there's some success, but then there's also a rebellion of the second generation, and there is report also of the continuing death of the first generation, right? As we come up to the end of the 40 years, then we get the report that even Moses and Aaron of the first generation, they're going to die in the wilderness and they will not enter the land. Wow. Pretty amazing. But it's all consistent, right? It is really a report of the announcements, how the first generation was going to die. The second generation will take possession of the land after the 40 years. Then we get to the third long-term report. Here things are going to shift completely, because now we have success, but also we have rebellion and death of the second generation. All the first generation has pretty much died. Maybe Moses is the only one hanging around. But now the second generation is experiencing the same things as the second. So therefore, the theme of the book, right? We gotta make sure that Moses is saying we gotta make sure the second generation avoids the problems of the first. Because what we have here in 21 to 25 is Balaam and Balak and Balaam. Remember, Balak is going to hire Balaam to come and curse the people, but he can't, because the camp is blessed. That's the success of the second generation. However, they have an evil plan. They're going to say, well, we can't curse them, but we sure can have their God judge them. So how about we bring some nice looking Moabite girls and we entice them to come and get defiled. And that way God, we know the story, it's going to come and he's going to judge Israel. So that's the conclusion there of the report. Now, that is this long consequence. As you can see, there's only 3 themes. It's not difficult, but it is very elaborate. Look at that. It goes from chapter 14 all the way to 25. I've never seen anything like this. This is the book of bringing out the consequences of Israel's failure to be a war camp and be a holy camp. All right, we could have closed the book here and go home and feel pretty good, but we still have 10 chapters. What are we going to do with this? Where does it fit? So I was racking my brain and studying and reading and, how does this thing fit? Because you still have 10 chapters from 26 to 36. Is that 10 chapters? Or is it 11, actually? If you're counting 26 and 36. That's 11 chapters. So I got to fix my math. So let's take a look at the at the literary structure, because as I was reading and rereading, what came to my mind was, okay, some of this stuff sounds like um, judgments on, or decisions, let's put it that way, mishpatim, decisions, but having to do with uh, the portioning of the land that eventually Joshua is going to carry out. It's anticipating the possession of the land, and God is giving specific instructions as to how to go about distributing the land. And so what I figured out is that all of this stuff, number one, is it has to do with inheriting the land, which they are getting ready to do that, right? And and so as I was reading and rereading, two things came to my mind. Number one, from the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, some of the things that archaeology has recovered from the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia, from Assyria, Babylon, certainly from Egypt, the land of Israel, all of that area, the north and all that stuff. We see there that in some instances, let's say a king wanted to have, an important person come and be part of his court. And so what he would do as a compensation, he would give him some land, he would grant him some land. And so he will have his people, his slaves, people working the land for him. Let's see, I think we're having we're gonna need to mute everybody here. Okay, we're back. So so this will be written, it will be given in formally, it will be given this piece of land, and that will be called a land grant. So that's some of the documents that have been recovered, some of the clay tablets are actually land grants. And also we have what are called law codes. And so what I'm thinking is, what we have here is, in a way, it's a law code that has to do with the inheritance of the land. So some decisions that God is passing down, kind of like what we have in Exodus 21 to 23, right? We have a law code there having to do with civil civil cases and criminal cases. And we have a law code in Leviticus, having to do with the hukim, with the commandments for proper worship. And then we have a huge law code in Deuteronomy that has to do also with the hukim and the mishpatim, commandments, kind of like the combination of Leviticus and Exodus. In Exodus, you have the mishpatim, laws concerning social justice. And then in Leviticus, you have worship commandments. That's what you have combined in Deuteronomy, and it goes from chapter 40 to 26. It's huge. We call that also a law code, right? And so I'm thinking, I think what we have in Numbers is also a law code, but it is an inheritance code. So I'm calling it an inheritance code and a land grant. And to me, that made sense of these 11 chapters. And so I saw it as, in four different sections. Number one, preparation for land inheritance. That's going to cover a couple of chapters. And then preparation for worship, possessing the land, agriculture, and the feasts, as we see in chapters 28 and 29. The statutes about the vows of women, combining, this is, remember, we have the war camp and the holiness camp, right? So combining these two subjects here, you're going to inherit the land through war with the Canaanite, but this is also a holiness camp too. So the vows, they have to do with people taking a vow, elevating their status of temporarily elevating their holiness status. That's what a vow does. And then we have preparation for war, that is going to be about conquering the land. And we have preparation for inheriting the land. So all has to do with the land. So what I'm saying here is then that the plot of the book comes to an end here with the consequence, but we don't get a proper conclusion. What we get is an appendix, and the appendix is the code, a land grant and the inheritance code. And to me, that's what makes sense of the rest of the book here as we finish the plot structure. Then we have this appendix here. And so we bring the book to a conclusion, and also our study tonight. So what do you think? You like it? You find it helpful? Let's chat a little bit. Let me turn off the recording and then we'll chat.